pro dnešní den. Tak. A teď se koukneme na jedno videjko, který mě strašně zajímá a je to vlastně o dalším vývojovým kroku ve virtuální realitě. Jo? Další vývojový krok virtuální reality a to je Nerv Gear. Nerv Gear, jak vystřižený ze Sword Art Online, prej. Tak zkusíme, jestli tam budou český titulky, snad to budete chápat, já doufám, že to budete chápat.
Welcome to Frality for all your VR and AR news. The first Sword Art Online VR headset is finally here, letting you soon full dive into the world of SAO. But before you take out your swords to clear all the floors, make sure you completely destroy that subscribe button on your way in. And with that said, let's dive right into it. After waiting for so long, we finally got some big news about a Nerf Gear-like headset finally coming out in real life. And also a lot of big news from some other companies that are working on the exact same thing. So for those who don't know, let's have a quick recap. Sword Art Online is an anime that takes place in the year 2022, where the main character, named Kirito, uses this amazing VR headset called the Nerf Gear, and with it, he manages to full dive into the world of SAO. But the most interesting thing is how this headset works, because it has a special feature where it can both read and send signals directly to your brain. While this might sound crazy, this allows the user to experience virtual reality as if it was real life, making it almost impossible to distinguish the virtual world from the real one. And this is exactly what all of us have been waiting for so long. The only big problem in SAO was if the player's health bar drops to 0, it means a game over in real life as well. But let's not worry too much.
Děkuju, Guláši, děkuju. On to musel dělat.
Herďo, Allah tě miluje. Modlil jsem se za tebe a jako oběť jsem vhodil Enapo do vzduchu. Ale přežil jsem to. Abych ti ukázal cestu do nebe, kde budeš mít svůj harém.
Nice.
Allah je s tebou. Allah tě miluje.
Děkuji.
Allahu Akbar a Gothaj pičo. Tak pravil Mahomet.
Mahomet, děkuji za 50 korun. Je tam ještě jeden mým od Krepika. Každý masterpiece má svoji levnou kopii. Ty vole, doslova si mohl mít šanci zítra tady s tímhle mýmem Krepiku. Před 4 minutama, koukám se.
Much about that. There were many companies up until now that have tried to achieve to make a full dive Nerf Gear in real life. And while a lot of first steps were made, most of these companies didn't manage to pull it off in the end. Think about the half dive VR headset. While it had a crazy concept where the user was laying down under a bed, just like we see in Sword Art Online. However, the headset did not include a BCI, that stands for Brain Computer Interface, so it wasn't capable of sending or receiving signals from your brain. And in the end, the project actually didn't come out. But one of the biggest news we had for a long time is that the first official VR headset with a Brain Computer Interface is finally here. The big VR company called Varjo is the maker of one of the highest end VR headsets in the whole world, with one of their most famous headsets having a screen quality that is as high as the human eye can perceive. And the company now announced that they made their first VR headset with a brain computer interface into it. And it even looks almost exactly the same like the Nerf Gear from SAO. So let's talk about how it actually works. Because Varjo partnered up with a company called OpenBCI. And you might have heard about them before, because they are the same company that is working together with Valve on their neural face headset called Project Gallia, which is most probably gonna be their direct competition. But the craziest part is that this headset is not just a concept, because it turns out that they're already sending out these headsets for beta testing, which makes it almost exactly like we saw in Sword Art Online. So let's talk about this headset in more detail. It basically consists of 2 main parts. The first one being the Varjo headset itself, and the second one being the Gallia module that is tracking your brain, and combining these two to create a Nerf Gear-like headset.
Takže sex RP konečně bude opravdový sex. Já si myslím, že při nejlepším to momentálně funguje tak, že prostě čumíš do té obrazovky v těch brailích a čte ti to nějaký signály z mozku a těma signálama prostě ovládáš věci v té hře. Jo, pochybuju, že to je fakt jako Sword Art Online, že vyloženě ty vole si do toho potopíš. Ale jako někde se musí začít, no.
But interestingly, the Gallia part that is tracking the signals coming from your brain is a lot more advanced than we thought in the first place. Because until now, most companies that try to achieve this, like the NextMind module for VR headsets, were only using what we call an EEG, standing short for the expensive word electroencephalogram, which are capable of just reading your brain.
Prostě tam byl nějaký tlačítko a na tom bylo kolečko a když ty se zasoustředil na to kolečko, tak ti to vlastně přečetlo jakoby v tom mozku, že tvoje oko jako vnímá kolečko a poslalo to do toho. To jsem viděl, no. Takže tohle jako dál, OK.
Waves. But this Gallia module takes it to the next level because it also includes an EOG, an EMG, and an EDA. And don't worry if you don't know what this means. Basically, it is also capable, besides just reading your brainwaves, to also measure data about both your eyes, your heart, your skin, and even your muscles, making it the most advanced brain-computer interface that we have ever seen integrated into a VR headset. And while they are sending out their beta products, they are actually planning on releasing this headset this year, exactly like the release date of Sword Art Online. Do keep in mind that it is not possible to send signals back to the brain yet, as the only company that has managed to achieve this was by using a brain implant from none other than Elon Musk's company called Neuralink. But this is definitely the biggest step and closest we can get to a full...
To je to, u čeho chcíplo asi tak 40 šimpanzů, protože se o ně nestarali, no. Že to testovali na nich, ty čipy.
Live nerve gear right now. But it gets even better, because this is not the only nerve gear headset that will be coming out this year. But before we get into that, a quick word from the company that made this video possible.
If you are using your Quest 2 wirelessly, then you might be running into some issues with your connection. If you have to share your Wi-Fi with multiple people, then you might want to check out the gaming bridge from Nexus Link, because this will allow you to have a direct connection with your router, and by doing so, reducing your lag and latency drastically. If you're interested, I will leave a link in the description below, and you can use the code FRELITY15 for 15% off of your total purchase. Now let's get right back into it.
The insane nerve gear like from Varjo is just the start of these types of VR headsets.
Tak co nám povíš, Maďare, k tomu?
Herďo, potřebuju tvoji pomoc. Poprvé v životě jsem slyšel vtip, kterému jsem se nedokázal zasmát. Vysvětlíš mi ho, prosím? Poslal mi to kámoš a zněl: takhle jdou dva židi kolem zdi koncentráku a ten jeden říká, kdyby ta zeď byla o 2 metry vyšší, tak ji přeskočím.
Tak to ti asi nevysvětlím, to vůbec nechápu. To nedává smysl. A hlavně cokoliv, v čem jsou židi nebo koncentrační tábory, tak není úplně OK tady řešit. Takže já jenom děkuju za donate a budu postupovat dál.
Sets, because as you might have heard before, OpenBCI is also working together with Valve, working on the same technology and trying to integrate it into the next Valve index, which might be even more interesting than the one we talked before. Because do keep in mind...
Imagine, že budeš potřebovat jenom headset a nebudeš potřebovat ani žádný ovladač. Vlastně to už máš teďka, no, jenom ti to snímá ruce, ale že už nebudeš muset ani hejbat rukama. No a vlastně budeme zase tam, kde jsme byli, lidi budou tloustou, protože se budou hejbat. Lucas Live, tak to nám moc dlouho ty letadla z Itálie nevydržely. Italská letadla Canadair se zítra vrací do Itálie, kde se potřeba k hašení požáru, čili jedná o zapůjčení letadel se Španělskem a Švédskem. Jo, protože Španělsko je určitě potřebovat nebude.
Mind that Varjo is one of the biggest enterprise headset makers, meaning that the price will probably be completely through the roof. But in case of Valve, this doesn't have to be the case. While their first VR headset, called the Index, was one of the highest quality VR headsets for many years, with a lot of people still using it to this day. And while it was not as cheap as something like the Quest 2, it did come with some crazy features for the time. But the Index is now already more than 3 years old, and most of them have been waiting for them to
Feels
announce
old,
their
man.
follow-up product. But it is clear to see why it took them so long, because they have been investing heavily in what they called their Project Gallia, making it a dream VR headset. Not only would it have an upgraded Valve Index, it also seemed to be standalone and have this Gallia brain reading module integrated into it, and hopefully also coming at a way lower price point compared to Varjo's version. The only problem is that we don't have an official release date of it yet. But with Varjo now coming out with the same type of headset, including the exact same brain reading technology from the company OpenBCI, it sure should put a lot of pressure on Valve to release some news about it soon. And the reason why this is such a big deal for VR is because this could set a starting point for competition for which VR company can make the best Nerve Gear-like headset, with it all officially starting in the exact same year that Sword Art Online took place as well. Of course, besides the VR hardware, we also will need an official Sword Art Online VR game, but those details we'll discuss in another video. So if you don't want to miss that, make sure you completely destroy that subscribe button, and while you're at it, destroy that like button as well.
And if you like VR and AR news, then
Můj bože. Zase jebej, ty vole, tak aspoň víme, jak na tom jsou, no. Čína versus Spojený státy, kdo vyhraje třetí světovou? Já nakouknu do GTAčka, jestli tam mám jednoho člověka. Který ho potřebuju, jestli tam je. Když tak, kdyby tam nebyl, tak si to pustíme ještě to video. Ale to, jak jsem se pochlubil si monitorem, se musím pochlubit tímhle, říkej mi Pro Gamer. Wow, ty jsi vyhrál 5 her po sobě? Děláš si prdel? To jde asi trošičku jednodušeji, když to máš z něčeho normálního, ne? To se jako věřím svůj Discord účet z KKRP, netuším. Netuším, já s tím problémy neměl. Já s tím problémky neměl. Je vůbec Artix? Je vůbec Artix? Krucinál. Ty vole. Já ho jdu najít na Discordu. Už to nebyl. Artix. On hraje Vovko?
Bráň, ďačko, kurva.
Ale však já, chápeš to, my jenom zalezeme, já tady neprojdu přes ty pičoviny.
Čau Pepo.
No.
Čau.
120.
Čau,
Jak
vám
se
jebe na
máš?
hlavu, vy jste vyjebanci, skurvení, všichni skápete do minuty.
120 na našem spawnu.
Nějak vypadáš při třetí
Jo, zníš
nejhorší
tak, no.
poezii ve vesmíru.
Strašně nahoře.
Co ty?
Já jako asi dobrý no,
Co chceš, Pavle?
Nic, jenom jsem se chtěl zeptat, jestli žiješ a jestli čteš zprávy a takové věci.
Však jsme si psali.
No jo,
Máme
ale...
ještě zprávy vyloženě.
To je trochu pravda, no. Když se podíváš na můj stream, tak uvidíš, co mám na práci.
No hraješ Vovko, já vidím.
A je to fakt kurva náročný.
Jo, počkej, kde vůbec seš, co tam máš?
Co děláš? Proč? Co
Lovec-
dělám Unrated a ty saveuješ?
Lovec Rogun. Ty hraješ klasik?
Čo ti je? David, drž piču, David.
TBCčko, no.
Já
Aha.
minus 120, já mám 0.
Zajímavý, se připravuješ na ten Lich King, jo?
Yes.
Ty vole, ok.
Přesně tak.
Tak to je první člověk, co mi do toho asi peer pressure, ne no? To bude zase závislá na... No nic, Pepo,
Ale
já
ty
nebudu
ale
rušit
ty
tady
jsi
vaši
šalík, vole.
grupu. Cože jsem? Jo, aha, vlastně, no jo, Ježíši Kriste, no tak nic. Tak
jsem
nic, tak
nevěděl,
v
že
pohodě.
nebudem.
Tak se budu věnovat
Čo?
aspoň manželce, měj se, čus.
Že na to můžeme jít.
Ježišmarja, on je vlastně ten hordák zajebanej. Ujeva. Ach jo. Tak. Neskusit to síla. A když tam nebude síl... No počkej, já to zjistím vždycky. Protože je online. Na Discordu. Otázka je, jestli je... Zase nic. Za Hordu život položím, ne, to si nenapsal, Domsone. To si nenapsal. Jak může Viktor Kravčenko být hordák? Tomu nerozumím. To nejde. Ježiš, ok, no. Za Hordu. Tak jdem si pustit China versus United States.
With Russia's invasion of Ukraine, most of
Jo, teďka je to docela relevantní, jo. Teďka je to docela relevantní, protože Čína docela chřastí zbraněma, jo. Možná ten konflikt o ten Tajvan vyeskaluje tady v tohleto.
the world's attention is on Eastern Europe and a potential confrontation between Russia and America. However, for those in the know, the real cause for concern is China's reaction to Russia's invasion. Rather than joining the world in condemning Russia, China has joined India in sidelining the seriousness of the invasion. Even worse, China now supports and helps spread Kremlin propaganda, suppressing the atrocities committed by Russia on Ukrainian civilians. Why is China so interested in helping Russia weather the global storm it unleashed? Because China has plans to launch its own invasion, and that puts it on a collision course with the United States of America. Not long ago, China's President Xi Jinping stated that China must reunite the breakaway island of Taiwan.
Maďarský guláš, děkuji za 30 fňuk. A jo, promiň, děkuji za 100 korun, já jsem zapomněl, promiň.
Se mi docela líbila.
No,
To je dobrý, skvělý, pokračuj. Některým slovům jsem nerozuměl, ale bylo to velmi působivé.
Nebyl pitlík.
pokračuj.
Ano, zajímavé rytmické prostředky, které jsou kontrapunktem k základní metafoře lidskosti. Vogonskosti. Vogonskosti, pardon, vogonskosti, básníkovi duše. Dobrý, jo.
Takže, podle tebe, píšu poezii proto, že přes svůj podlý, hnusný, bezcitný zevnějšek toužím pouze být milován.
Ano, 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 ano.
Počkej.
Fretná chrochtobuznost.
Ne, to vážně, fakt.
A jo, to je z tohohle filmu, už to chápu.
Podle žvastopunkcery na plzné
Tu referenci.
Vogonská poezie je pokládána za třetí nejhorší ve vesmíru. Druhá nejhorší je ta od Asgotů z Krya. Když král jejich básníků Chrochtos nadýmavý recitoval svou ódu na hrudku hnusu, již jsem objevil v podpaždí jednoho jitra, 4 posluchači zemřeli na vnitřní krvácení a předseda komise pro mrzačení umění přežil jen proto, že si uhryzl nohu.
Nebo tě roztrhám na fidlo prčičky svým prkodrťákem.
Nejhorší poezii psala Paula Nancy Millstone Jenningsová ze Sussexu. Naštěstí byla zničena spolu se zemí.
Tak bacha na to. Ano, nože pozemšťané máte na vybranou. Buď zemřete v kosmickém vzduchoprázdnu, nebo mi řekněte, jak se vám líbila moje báseň.
Jo, sorry.
With the mainland. After World War II, Chinese nationalists continued their war against rebel communist forces, inevitably losing and being forced to flee the mainland for the island of Taiwan. In the years since, Taiwan has flourished into a vibrant democracy and a major global economy, but China refuses to acknowledge its independence and threatens military action and economic punishment against anyone who does. The problem with what would be an otherwise internal security matter for the Chinese is that the US has vowed to defend the fellow democracy against Chinese aggression. But why does China want Taiwan so bad? The reasons are numerous, but chief amongst them is because Taiwan represents a critical strategic vulnerability to China. Currently, China is hemmed in by what's known as the First Island Chain. This includes Taiwan, the northern Philippines, Borneo, Japan, and the Ryukyu Islands. Originally, the United States used the First Island Chain as a strategy to hem in the Soviet Union and its allies during the Cold War. and deny them access to the Pacific in case of a war. To that end, it established strong relationships with all First Island chain nations in partnerships that continue to this day. Now the Cold War is over, but a new Cold War has dawned, and China is America's new rival. With pro-US forces all along the First Island chain, China will never be able to be a true global power, as its navy is too vulnerable to attack. Taking Taiwan will break the island chain in two and give China an island fortress from which to project power deep into the Pacific. But Taiwan is itself a critical threat to China's continued existence, or at least its continued existence under the dictatorship of the Chinese Communist Party. As a democratic state, Taiwan is an example to all of China of a different, better way of life, and many young Chinese people who are being increasingly exposed to foreign culture are growing tired of the oppressive rule of the CCP. For them, Taiwan is a beacon of hope for what China could look like, rather than the nation of strict censorship, government intimidation, and very limited freedom that exists today. Despite erecting the Great Firewall in order to try and limit China's access to uncensored information, the influence from outside of China still reaches many of the country's citizens. This is a dire threat to the CCP, and thus neutralizing Taiwan and bringing it into the fold is but one step into ensuring its own survival. Next, it must topple the United States as the head of the global order so it can export its brand of authoritarianism around the globe. If it can control global culture, it doesn't need to fear rebellion within its own borders. Taking Taiwan is a strategic necessity if China is going to be able to challenge the influence of the US. If China is going to rise as the dominant superpower, or even just one that can compete with the United States, it must also be able to control the South Pacific. Currently, the United States Navy operates with impunity across the Pacific, and this puts critical Chinese trade routes in serious risk in case of war against the US. China imports the majority of its oil and relies on exports for much of its trade. If the US were to cut this lifeline off, China's economy would shrink significantly. Taking Taiwan and throwing the US out of the South Pacific thus ensures the safety and security of its trade, and removes the dagger the US currently holds to China's throat in case of a war. But how exactly is China going to take on the world's most powerful military? Is it truly capable of challenging the US? And what do the numbers say? China's strategy to dethrone the US is to dominate what has come to be called the Fourth Industrial Revolution. The First Industrial Revolution was the use of steam power to mechanize production, allowing for never-before-seen productivity and efficiency. Not long after came the Second Industrial Revolution, heralded by cheap and abundant electricity, which allowed mass production on an epic scale. The Third Industrial Revolution introduced advanced electronics and information technology to automate production, and now we're building on this revolution for what will become known as the Fourth Industrial Revolution. This new revolution will be a digital revolution, with billions of people connected electronically and breakthroughs in artificial intelligence, robotics, 3D printing, quantum computing, and other fields. Much like the first factory to install a steam engine couldn't picture what the world would look like just 10 years from then, it's hard for us to predict what life will look like in the wake of the Fourth Industrial Revolution, though it is going to be the most revolutionary change in the affairs of human history. However, China is picturing the Fourth Industrial Revolution as the key to global hegemony, and it's investing billions into ensuring that it is the dominant power in the new world to come. China's strategy to dominate the world in the coming decades is a fusion of civilian and military application of technology. First, it's striving to be a leader in the technology department, ensuring that it is the first to create revolutionary technologies, thus enriching itself financially and creating dependency from the world on Chinese goods and services. Secondly, China is seeking to quickly turn new technological breakthroughs into usable military technologies that will allow it to surpass and dominate the US. As increasing the speed of future warfare, with future military success reliant on having forces that are mechanized, informatized, and intelligentized. According to the 2021 DoD's China Military Power Report, what this means is that China understands that victory is only possible with fully mechanized forces capable of being quickly moved into a conflict zone and supported with heavy firepower. However, those forces must also have access to a wealth of information via disseminated sensor systems, with this information shepherded through artificial intelligence that can give battlefield commanders exactly the information they need at the moment, while temporarily ignoring what they don't. Warfighters don't just need information, they need help sorting through it quickly, utilizing what's presently useful. If this sounds familiar to any of our viewers, it's because this is exactly the requirements the US military was investigating just a few years ago. China's Academy of Military Science has now established a mandate that the People's Liberation Army's warfighting theory and doctrine fully capitalize on disruptive technologies like AI and autonomous systems. Much like the US did in the First Cold War, China's focus is on building a modern state-of-the-art force. But today's force must be capable of accessing vast amounts of information and supported by AI
Now this shotgun is smarter than you.
And assist with decision-making. China wants to teach machines how to wage war, so they can advise commanders in the thick of battle. Currently, the Chinese military is not very well networked, but those capabilities are increasing every year. It was only a few years ago that China first established a combined arms operations capability by establishing joint chains of command between its services in the same style as the United States. Now it seeks to match the US's networked capabilities by 2027 and then exceed them shortly after. But why is networking so important? Well, for one, it's what makes the US military so immediately lethal to opponents. Having the ability to network together ground, sea, air, and space assets allows for the swift exchange of information and gives a fighting force incredible adaptability and initiative on the battlefield. For an example of what happens when a modern force is not networked, all one has to do is look at the terrible losses being suffered by the Russians against a nation a fraction their size and capability. In the 21st century, the Russian military is still fighting battles like it was World War II, and the Ukrainians are making them suffer for it. In order to become a global leader in defense technology, China is taking a page straight out of the US's book by pursuing a strategy of civil military fusion. What made the United States the superior power during the First Cold War was the close partnership between its military and civilian industry, which thrived in an environment of innovation. Such a partnership allowed for a swift adaptation of civilian technological breakthroughs into military assets and vice versa. With US military technology breakthroughs quickly adapted into civilian technologies, making US companies the most competitive in the world. Artificial intelligence, robotics, quantum computing, and biotechnology will shape not just the future of warfare, but of human society itself. Achieving technological superiority and leadership in one or more of these areas will make China a true competitor to the United States. Achieving hegemony over all these critical areas will make China an insurmountable superpower. In order to achieve the goal, China is investing heavily in domestic innovation, but also in foreign investment to acquire technology, the recruitment of global talent, academic collaboration for research and development, and finally, China's strong point, military and industrial espionage. So how is the US preparing for this looming confrontation? First, as scary as China's ascension may seem, it's important to remember that it's still running uphill against America. Since the end of the First Cold War, the United States has influenced a new global order based on growing liberal democratic values. As we've seen in the global backlash against Russia, the New World Order frowns on the autocracies and abuses of the Old World. Vladimir Putin is a relic of the Old World with no place in modern society. And with a unified voice, the West has shouted him and his nation down, even going so far as to severely hurt themselves financially in order to punish Russian military aggression. This should be of grave concern to China's Xi Jinping and his Chinese Communist Party, as they too are relics of the Old World. The uprisings in Hong Kong that lasted for months are but a taste of the simmering tension just under the surface of Chinese society, and proof to the CCP of the corrupting influence of liberal Western values. Should China follow in Russia's footsteps and engage the world in hostility, it too will quickly find itself a pariah and outcast nation, effectively crippling any bid to become a global leader. This is why it's important for China to undermine Western values. The United States remains the world leader in technological innovation, despite mounting pressure from China and beyond. But the US is far ahead in one important area of technology, its ability to rapidly commercialize new and emerging technology on global markets. While Chinese technology grows in influence around the world, American companies are already globally established brands. China's modern problem is in convincing the world to buy more than just cheap manufactured goods from it. US commercial success is also due to its global culture domination. American brands are present in every country on earth, but so is its culture. With one of the most rapidly evolving cultures in the world, US culture can be hard to define or nail down, but cultural export instruments such as Hollywood and Silicon Valley remain unassailable by their Chinese counterparts. For instance, while China may have developed the massively popular TikTok app, it wasn't until China pushed the app on the American marketplace and established relationships with American influencers that the app exploded in popularity. This is important because military and economic might only count for so much, and the US has used culture to bridge ideological gaps with partner nations around the world. Shared culture is the bedrock of strong strategic partnerships, and China has absolutely nothing of the like except for its partnership with North Korea. Shared culture and shared values are the reason the US remains the leader of the free world, and not because of its military being the strongest. Culture is another problem for China in its ongoing confrontation against the US and the rest of the West, because one of China's biggest problems is creating immigrant Chinese citizens. While over 1 million Chinese Americans reside in America, only a few thousand American Chinese have made their home in China. If China seeks to dominate future technologies by recruiting promising talent from around the world, it must be able to entice them, not just financially, but also with a desire to make China their new home. This is a massive problem for China versus the US, which remains one of the most attractive destinations for the world's most talented, due to not just economic opportunity, but its liberal democratic values. Finally, China must not just triumph over the US in future competition, but against the world, because outdoing the United States in one or more areas of technological innovation means little due to wide-reaching US alliances and partnerships. For America, a win by one of its allies is still a win for the US, while China must stand against the world completely alone. But how do the numbers stand today? What if a conflict broke out tomorrow between the two military heavyweights?
No.
Currently, the US is ranked as the world's #1 military power, with China in the #3 spot. However, this is debatable as given Russia's extremely poor performance in Ukraine, we
Number 2 v Ukrajině možná tak, no.
expect that China will climb to the #2 spot by next year, dethroning Russia, whom it seems derives most of its power from its ability to threaten with nuclear weapons. However, poor Russian performance should deeply concern China, because just like Russia, the Chinese military is also completely untested against modern capable foes. While Russian forces were more than adequate to crush uprisings in Aleppo and Chechnya, Russian superiority in numbers with equipment meant very little when it went up against Ukraine's Western-trained military, with China's last war being in Vietnam in the 70s, a conflict it ended up losing. China should be extremely concerned about facing the United States in battle, whom, unlike China, is thoroughly tested in modern combat. Much like Russia, China has lacked a robust training regimen for its military, with exercises typically being highly scripted and mostly for the benefit of visiting dignitaries. This culture has begun to change within China, but the nation is yet to match the robust training schedule of the US military. Realistic training, though, is not enough for the Chinese military, as it...
Žiju? Je dobré. Jo no, v tom RPčku toho pro mě už moc není, no. Já bych asi pomalu organizovat tu JFC party na příští sobotu. A pak to asi zabalíme, čete. Předáme to tu organizaci někomu, aby to fungovalo. A pak začne nová éra. Čína versus Tajvan je dobré i tohle video, akorát mají CZ titulky, video popisuje samotnou taktiku, jako by Čína pravděpodobně použili s fokusem o landing na Tajvanu.
Also like Russia, must also contend with a legacy of corruption that has plagued its ranks for decades. President Xi Jinping's massive anti-corruption effort has produced great results, but the service must still contend with many officers who hold rank due to the time-honored Chinese tradition of gifting, wherein a junior official gifts a senior official in exchange for promotion. Currently, the Chinese military numbers at 2 million strong, dwarfing the US military in its 1.39 million strong force. This gives China a numbers advantage, but the US retains a great deal of force multipliers that don't just even the playing field but tip it decisively in its favor. Chief amongst these is a well-trained and well-equipped modern fighting force, while Chinese units vary widely in modernity. A hefty investment in precision weaponry, integrated forces, and superior sensor and tracking technologies make the US a lethal adversary even against a numerically superior foe. Reserves will play a critical role in any Sino-American conflict, but both sides are nearly evenly matched, with China having 510,000 ready reservists versus the US's 442,000. American reservists receive continual training of 1 weekend a month and 2 weeks out of the year, while training for Chinese reservists is improving but still spotty. This provides the US with a smaller reservist pool, but one that is more quickly capable of being introduced into the fight, while Chinese reservists require longer training periods or risk being thrown into combat completely unprepared. The American defense budget dwarfs China's at $770 billion versus China's $250 billion, but that's not telling the whole story. First, the US budget includes many costs for operations that would have nothing to do in case of war with China, such as funding for its 11 unified combatant commands spread out across the world. These combatant commands are responsible for general peacekeeping, and their presence is a globally stabilizing force. Without them, local conflicts would quickly sprout and spiral out of control. For example, without US Central Command, Iran would quickly seek to neutralize regional adversaries such as Saudi Arabia, causing massive global disruption of oil and other trade that passes through the region. Also, China does not count all of its military investments within its published budget report, cleverly hiding them within other non-military budgets. A large part of its nuclear modernization initiative, for example, is coming from funds outside of its official military budget. Lastly, because Chinese military equipment is sourced locally, it pays less for goods than the US does for its own equipment. And that's because the standard of living is lower in China, with lower wages and less benefits, which means cheaper production costs. When compared by purchasing power parity, China's budget is significantly closer to the US's than a first glance would lead one to believe. Any war between the US and China would be waged at sea and air, making comparisons of the two sides' air forces and navies of utmost importance. The US operates an air fleet of 13,247 aircraft, easily dwarfing the Chinese air fleet of 3,285. When it comes to fighter aircraft, the two sides are close together, with the US having 1,957 fighters versus China's 1,200. American air mobility absolutely dwarfs Chinese mobility, though, with a transport fleet of 982 versus China's 286. Understandable given that the US faces conflicts far from its own shores, and China has little need to move its own forces significant distances. However, the massive advantage in airlift capability makes the US military much more flexible and agile than the Chinese military. Perhaps the most important distinction between the two air forces, though, is the number of special mission aircraft, with the US operating 774 versus China's 114.
že
The
Číňani
US
mají
has
na
placed
hovno
a premium
letectvo,
on
ne?
equipping aircraft for everything from early warning to electronic and signals intelligence and anti-submarine warfare. The US dwarfs China in special mission capabilities, and it's part of what makes the US Air Force and Navy so lethal. Unless a confrontation...
Děkuju moc na Matěji, děkuju.
Tohle video je propagandistická sračka zanimovaná tak, aby to chytlo i děti a cepalo jim názory, že Amerika je nejlepší a Rusko s Čínou nejhorší. Všechno to jsou lži a podvody. Okamura by k tomu řekl svoje. Nechceme tu Číňany SPD, jedině Ortel taky.
Jistě. Děkuji za 50 korun, Matěj.
Between the US and China takes place on Taiwan, attack helicopters won't figure into the equation. However, if they do, the US outnumbers China with 910 versus China's 281. Numbers only tell part of the story, though, because the weapon systems used by both sides only further skew the advantage to the US. For air superiority, the US fields the F-15 Eagle and F-18 Super Hornet. A fleet of 187 operational F-22s are unmatched by China, who is yet to field its own fifth-generation fighter in any significant numbers. Adding to China's problem is the US's Rapid Raptor program, which aims to bring a sizable contingent of F-22s to any battle space in the world within 24 hours. China's competitor versus the Raptor is the J-20, which is equipped with inferior engines versus American planes, requiring the use of canards on the body of the plane. These canards and other obvious engineering flaws have led to defense analysts to conclude the J-20 has at best only a slightly smaller radar cross-section than a traditional fourth-generation fighter. In fact, India claims it has frequently observed and tracked Chinese J-20s with long-range radar. The rest of the Chinese Air Force varies widely in modernity, with a significant part of its Air Force still flying Cold War Russian-made or Chinese-licensed relics. While China would initially put its most modern fighters, such as the J-16, J-11s, and Su-30s, into the fight first, once those have been downed, it'll be increasingly reliant on older and older planes. Meanwhile, the United States doesn't just have a completely modern air fleet, but it's adding dozens of fifth-generation F-35s every year to its arsenal. The U.S. Air Force now has over 280 F-35s it can bring to the fight, with an additional 157 being added a year across the various services. In a war where air power would be decisive, the U.S. not only has the numbers advantage, but also the technological advantage. At sea, the U.S. Navy is outnumbered by the Chinese Navy, with 484 vessels versus China's 777. However, there are numbers, once again, only telling part of the story. The U.S. operates 11 aircraft carriers versus China's 2, and American aircraft carriers can bring over 800 aircraft into the fight versus China's grand total of 70. China's inflated naval numbers take into account things like missile boats, of which it has 84, while the U.S. only operates 10. In terms of tonnage, the U.S. Navy has over twice the hardware of the Chinese Navy, 4.6 million tons versus 2 million tons. A better way to compare the capabilities of the two fleets is to use a modern metric, Battle Force missiles. This is a count of the total number of missiles that a fleet has for use in combat before requiring resupply. This includes anti-ship missiles, land attack missiles, surface-to-air missiles, and torpedoes. Excluded from the count are short-range self-defense missiles like the US's Sea Ram.
Chtěl bych někdy, aby se ty donaco se z nějakého nevysvětlitelného důvodu, který se děje jen při určité konstelaci zasraných podělaných hvězd, poslalo pod mojím pravým jménem, neposlali. Nechápu, proč se to děje. Fixni to, kurva.
Já nevím, jak to fixnout, ty vado, gulaši, já fakt nevím, já jsem nikdy Dona neposílal. Ale ohledně Tajvanu bych byl klidný, aby ho Čína reálně dobila, tak by potřebovala větší sílu, jak to byla při D-Day, zatím nejsou žádné známky toho, že by Čína nějak víc přesouvala armádu, takže neplánují zaútočit, reálně by to přeskupení trvalo několik měsíců. No, tak viděli jsme nějaký sněm o tom, kde se dohadovali, jak nějaký ten kraj to jako už přesune, no.
In 2019, the US Navy had 11,834 Battle Force missiles versus China's 5,250. The gap is narrowing, but not significantly, with China adding 15 more Type 55 cruisers with 112 missile cells and 6 torpedo tubes each throughout the 2020s. That will increase total Battle Force missiles by 1,770, just over half of what the US fields. Under the surface, China has the advantage with 71 submarines versus the US's 68. However, Chinese subs are mostly conventionally powered, while the US subs are all nuclear. That makes US submarines much more robust and able to operate for longer, but also decreases their vulnerability while operating.
Juris jako za 70.
Nechcem vám hovorit čisté kokoty, ale USA a Rusko po sebe nebudu hadzat atomovky z praktického důvodu, vyhubili by lidstvo, ale čo taky Irán začne na Palestinu hádzat bomby alebo Izrael. Stačí 20 nekoordinovaných vybuchov a zahmélíte atmosféru o 30 skapme.
To ono. Otázka je, jestli si udělají ty atomovky, no. Jsou to schopní, ale ještě, co jsem jako koukal, tak ještě neprohlásili, že to mají.
These submarines are also an order of magnitude louder than US subs, with their Jin-class ballistic missile submarines having an acoustic signature of around 120 decibels, while American Virginia-class submarines have an acoustic signature of 95 decibels, which is just 5 decibels over background ocean noise at an average of 90 decibels. Submarine warfare has always been a weakness of China, and it looks to continue being so for the foreseeable future. While the US clearly has the naval advantage, it's important to remember that China can concentrate most of its fleet into a Pacific war against America, while the US has naval commitments around the world. Even if it were to recall the bulk of its fleet for action in the Pacific, such an act would take from days to weeks to mature into a sizable transit of combat power into the theater. Realistically speaking, the US Navy maintains an edge over China, but the two sides are very close to parity in terms of capabilities. Where the US advantage comes is in its ability to quickly replenish combat losses with well-trained crews